All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our next presentation on human and natural disturbances to ecosystems. We're going to try to look at the cause and effects that these have on our ecosystems and what impact they have on humans. So when we're talking about Earth, we have to talk about the biosphere, and we have to talk about all the ecosystems that affect this. And Earth is really our home, and it depends upon healthy ecosystems and what impact we have on those ecosystems in order to be sustainable. Now, when we talk about human impact, one of the most common examples that people use are oil spills, and specifically the BP oil spill. And humans can have a negative impact on the environment when something potentially goes wrong. So during the BP oil spill, unfortunately, one of the offshore oil rigs spilled a whole bunch of oil, and it had a devastating impact on the Gulf. So going through and connecting all this back, well, how do humans impact the ecosystem? And then we're going to look at how, in class, how natural systems go through and impact the ecosystem. And then we can come up and delve into the ideas on how to potentially fix this. So we can break it down into four main parts. So degradation of the environment, exploitation of species, introduction of invasive species, and then we can also think about pollution. So these are the ways that humans are going to go through and negatively impact the environment. They also impact it positively, but I want to focus on this so that way we can have a discussion in class about what's going on in our ecosystem. So let's start with degradation. Now, degradation is the reduction in habitat of a species, which ultimately affects reproduction, resource use, and population of the species within an environment or habitat. So when we think about degradation, we can think about deforestation, and we can think about overfishing and potential farmland use. And this can lead to habitat fragmentation, or the shrinking of populations into smaller subsets, which can cause a variety of issues. So we can think about a bottleneck effect. If populations get small enough, they can go through and we lose genetic material within that population, and we're losing alleles. And we also think about how those populations are going to reproduce and prosper in the future. Now, if we're thinking about degradation and its impact on humans, well, it's going to reduce animal and plant populations, which are required for food and resources, which are necessary for us to live and sustain a healthy civilization and environment. Now, exploitation is when we're going through and using species short term for profit without necessarily putting in the precautions necessary for those species to survive long term. A really common example of this is overfishing, and this is when we reduce viability of the population of fish, which can reduce the genetic diversity and cause the population to decline, or it can lead to extinction. So exploitation of tuna populations is a really large problem because we're shrinking and causing the tuna populations to shrink so much that we're losing alleles within those populations, and we're losing genetic diversity, and because of that, the population could go extinct if we reduce it to a small enough subset. Now, the reason overfishing is an issue is because now with mechanized fishing techniques, we've become very efficient at collecting fish. But the thing is we have to make sure that we're careful about this because it does have an effect on humans. It can limit plant and animal populations, which would have an effect on coastal and forested regions where their economies are very, very specific. So there's a lot of countries like Japan that depend on tuna fish populations to sustain their economy and sustain that fishing industry. So exploitation is when we're using the species short term without putting precautions in to profit off those species. So the next thing we have to talk about are invasive species. And invasive species are the introduction of non-native species, so species that have not normally lived there, and this is going to have an impact on the habitat where they're introduced. So it can have a variety of effects, and it's multifaceted. So if we look at this image here, we can see that if we're looking at zebra mussels, well, zebra mussels are going to alter the habitat because they're such efficient filtering organisms, and it's going to have an effect on the water quality for all of those other organisms. Another common example is competition. So North American gray squirrels have outcompeted the native red squirrels, and because of that, driven their population almost into extinction. And we can also think about disease and parasites being passed down from organism to organism. Remember, evolution takes a long time, and generating the necessary fail-safes and the necessary immune system responses in organisms to take care of these diseases and parasites take time. So the introduction of a disease that an organism has never seen can have a drastic effect on their population. Now, this is also going to have an effect on humans. Well, if we reduce native species within a population, it's going to have an impact on harvesting those local species if we use them for food or some sort of product. And it's also going to have an effect on the habitat of those localized regions where we live. Now, the last thing and the most common way that people think of affecting the environment is pollution. And climate change is probably the most common example. But pollution is not just going through and emitting CO2 and greenhouse gases in the air. Now, the impact that this is and what pollution is, it's the input of human products, either a gas, solid, or a liquid, into the environment that disrupt the balance of the ecosystem and have widespread effects on the biodiversity and organisms that reside in that area. So if we're thinking about this, a common example that I like to delve into is eutrophication and how this affects water quality in specific ecosystems. So normally we would want to have a water quality within an ecosystem that does not have a whole lot of nitrogen. Now, when we go through and put a lot of pollutants and put a lot of decomposing material, all of a sudden the water quality in that area is going to accumulate lots of nitrogen and accumulate lots of algae, which are going to have an effect on farming, and it's going to have an effect on that ecosystem. So when we're talking about pollution, well, this has a major effect in a variety of ways. It directly impacts the human habitat that we live in, which can have an effect on all the other things that we depend on. Now, when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about the emission of greenhouse gases, and this is because of the greenhouse effect. Now, greenhouse gases are normally good because they heat the surface of the earth, but if we get too many greenhouse gases, it can cause the entire temperature on the globe to warm too much, which can have an impact on all of the other ecosystems and environments and populations that we depend upon.